Hi, everybody. So as I said, I'm Jess. I'm just a little correction. I'm not a doctor. It might be a typo in the program there. I'm actually a nurse by background, and I've worked in clinical trials for a number of years. Now specifically working for the Blood Cancer Network Ireland. I'm going to try and whiz through the slides a little bit. Don't want to sort of speed it up too much, but I know we're a little bit behind time on the program as it is. But if I do go too fast, stop me and ask some questions. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Blood Cancer Network Ireland. Some of you may or may not be aware of us. Bit of an introduction to clinical trials. Some people may have been exposed to trials. Some people in the room won't have had any exposure at all. Excuse me. Current trials in myeloma and trials that are coming down the line in this country, and a little bit of information about the bigger picture of sort of global research and this kind of thing. Excuse me. So Blood Cancer Network may or may not have heard of us, but we're a very small network specifically targeting blood cancer treatments for Irish patients. So trying to get information specific to the patients in this country, offering them treatments that they wouldn't necessarily get as standard of care. So obviously the clinical trials is the bit that I'm here to talk about. There's also a blood cancer registry and a biobank where we store and look at the samples that blood cancer patients are giving to us to inform future research projects going forwards. This is just a bit of an overview of what I just said there, really. So the clinical trials, really, it's early phase clinical trials is what we try and focus on. So these are small clinical trials on very small numbers of patients, specifically trying to use new drugs that alongside sort of regimes that are used already in practice, just to try and give us information whether these ideas work and whether we can use them on a wider group of patients. This is us. You'll recognize a few faces, I think, from that map, but there's a network of us across the country, coordinated. So we cover all sort of corners of the country, if you like. There's centres in Dublin here, there's centres in Galway and down in Cork, so we can offer our services to try and capture as many Irish patients as we can in offering them these new treatments. So we're coordinated from Galway. But we have regular meetings, and the trials that we offer are offered throughout the hospitals across Dublin to give everybody an equal opportunity of availing of the new treatments that are coming through. A brief introduction to trials, because I'm not sure who's in the room and who's got experience with trials or not, so I just said I'd quickly run through the sort of history of trials. So a clinical trial is described as any research study that you're giving something to somebody and testing it against a group of people who are not getting that same thing, basically. Interventions in our case, we usually would give drugs or cells to patients, but clinical trials in general, that you can use medical devices or behaviours and this kind of thing to see if they make a positive impact or a negative impact on people's health and well-being. Trials aren't a new thing. As much as the sort of modern day trials look these days, they were experiments described back in the Bible. Not that I'm a big expert on it, but so I've been told. There's been a lot of experiments which could be described as trials throughout history, in the likes of prisoner of war camps and this kind of thing, that people were used to experiment drugs or treatments on. But you couldn't use the results of those because they weren't using it in a trial setting with a group who weren't getting the interventions at the same time. The first proper clinical trial was in 1747. I'm not going to go into it too much, but it was about sailors and proving the fact that you could prevent diseases on ships with citrus fruit, but I won't go into it too much because we're a bit tight on time. Trials in general is a long process. Getting a drug from the design phase or the lab phase, if you like, to actually knowing that it works on a group of people and knowing that it works safely on a group of people takes a lot of years. So it basically starts with, there's a lot of laboratories around the country where there's very brilliant scientists having ideas that these drugs might work on these cells, and then they're testing that obviously in a laboratory setting. Once you get through that phase, it's obviously then we need to see that it works in the people that it's designed to help. So testing its safety, making sure it works on the diseases, in this case obviously myeloma. There are a lot of approvals before you start testing new drugs or processes on patients that go through ethical review and a lot of regulatory tests and as well, and then only then can it come to the phase of into a clinical trial. So there's a lot of background work that happens. Just a little diagram here of how many sort of years and months it can take to get a drug from where it says the preclinical stage there up until sort of a phase 4 where we know the drug is safe to give to people. You're talking probably 15 to 20 years from the fact that the scientist in the lab says this is a good idea to that drug becoming the normal standard of care. It's a really long process to get through. So once the clever people in the lab have decided that this drug does what they think it's going to do in the lab, we then move on to the phase 1 of the clinical trial, which is where we're testing safety of that drug and making sure we can give that drug to patients or people without doing harm. And obviously in any of our sort of healthcare, we don't want to do more harm than what's already out there. So phase 1 is generally on a very small number of people, usually healthy people without the disease in question, to make sure that if we give that drug to those people, it's not going to make a leg fall off or this kind of thing, you know. And then once we've made sure it's safe to give to healthy volunteers, we would then generally test it on a small number of people with the disease under study. So, for example, 20, 25 people with myeloma would be given the drug. Then we make sure it actually works on the myeloma and it does what we think it's going to do. Once you've made sure it works on a small number of people, you move on to the phase 3, which is probably the most common kind of trials that are in this country at the moment, where there are the two groups of people. You're exposing half of them to the new drug and half of them not to the new drug. So then you can tell what's happening to the group of people who are having the new drug. And then the phase 4 is very much the sort of everything works, it's gone to market, and people are paying for it to be used in everyday practice. So clinical trials in general, like it says here, safety is paramount, really. We don't want to be giving drugs to people and making them feel worse than they already are and it not actually working on the disease. So the early phase studies are very much about identifying what level we can give the drugs to patients at, and making sure that any side effects are captured. And if the side effects are problematic, then obviously we stop giving the drug to people and the trial comes to an end, or the doses are modified. And then, optimizing the doses there as well. So I'll move on a little bit to current trials in this country. The Blood Cancer Network, as I'd said earlier, are responsible for sort of the really early phase studies, so a very small amount of people. And then I'll talk about countrywide trials as well, because obviously all of our trials would go through Cancer Trials Ireland, which would include the phase 2 and 3 trials in their portfolio as well. Myeloma being the disease that it is, and the small number of population that unfortunately are in the position of having this disease, there aren't many trials for me to stand here and talk to you about. And I'll sort of talk about the reasons for that as we go through. But this trial here, which is called Cyborg-Dara, a lot of the trials will have little acronyms on why they're called short names. So this is a study that we ran through the Blood Cancer Network Ireland in a group of 18 patients. So it's the really early phase trials that I was talking about earlier. And we were using this for upfront treatment of newly diagnosed patients. So patients who were eligible for transplant, using cyclophosphamide, bortezomib, dexamethasone, which is a standard of care regime, with the addition of daratumumab, which is a new drug, a monoclonal antibody, which some of you may have heard of. The trial generally followed the normal pathway of upfront treatment of myeloma. So you have your induction phase, you go off the transplant, consolidation phase, and then a maintenance phase. But it was just using the addition of this new drug, daratumumab, in addition to kind of like the normal pathway. Quickly go back to that one. So the trial at the moment is is closed for recruitment. We recruited all 18 patients across the country. We're quite quickly, actually. And there are currently 14 patients still on the study. Everybody's now into the maintenance phase. So we've got results from the induction and the consolidation of using the daratumumab alongside the standard of care. And the patients have tolerated it very well, and the results that have been presented are positive, if not better than the standard of care that is already out there. The difficulty is because we've only got those results on 18 patients, and it was only in this country. We then need to work towards making those results more generalizable to the rest of the country and then beyond, so we can use these early stage results to formulate new clinical trials on more patients, if that makes sense. The only other myeloma clinical trial that I know of to put into this presentation, which is also just closed, I believe, is a trial called RSQVD. So this was a phase 2 study, so bigger numbers than our study of 18. So I think there was a couple of hundred people in this study, which again was using the bortezomib and dexamethasone combination with lenalidomide. Some patients were eligible for transplant and some patients were not, and they all received maintenance therapy of lenalidomide after their transplant or as a maintenance regime. So I believe that the designers of this trial have stopped patients being on it now because it's actually proved that this combination of drugs works, and it's now standard of care to give the lenalidomide, I can never say that one, as maintenance therapy. So they're two trials that are kind of ongoing but paused or halted recruitment. So there's no new studies no new patients going onto those studies at the moment. Trials in the pipeline that I can speak about. CPG DARA is, again, it's initials for a short name, so cyclophosphamide, pomalidomide, dexamethasone, and daratumumab. So it's a very similar design to the small study, the 18-patient study that I spoke about before, but this is for patients with relapsed refractory myeloma rather than the upfront treatment group. So this is a group of patients who there aren't many studies out there in this country that they can avail of. So this is specifically for patients who've had at least 3 lines of treatment. So some of you in the room will be at that point where you've kind of had a line of treatment, a different line, and a third line. So we're looking at trying to sort of capture that group of people and offer them a different treatment regime to what's out there currently. So this is currently in the protocol writing stage. And we're probably hoping to open that in the first, probably January, February of next year, by the time all the papers are signed and all the I's are dotted, etc. The other study I can talk about at the moment is called the EMN18. EMN stands for European Myeloma Network. So this is a much bigger study that Ireland are fortunate to be involved in from a European perspective. So the small study that I'd spoken about before that we had run with the 18 patients has informed, the results of that have informed part of this bigger clinical trial, which is sort of great for our scientific sort of community, but also great for patients that we can offer sort of different treatments going forward. So this trial will be for the upfront treatment of newly diagnosed myeloma, and there will be several arms of treatment on this study. And controversially, as spoke about earlier, this will have the tandem transplant as part of the regime. So obviously there'll be a lot of education towards patients as the implications of what having 2 transplants will mean for them going forwards, and the differences between that and just having 1 transplant as standard of care. So that's a very complicated diagram that I'm not going to go through now because we're short on time. Hot topics in myeloma trials in general, I'm probably going to steal a little bit of thunder if I go into this too much of the speaker following me, so I'm not going to go into it too much because I'm not a scientist and I'm not a doctor, so I don't know very much sort of the technical bits, but you'll all have probably heard of Carty therapy, and it's obviously being sort of sold. You see headlines out there about this is the new miracle cure for cancer, and this is this is the way that everything should be going. But I always come to sort of events like this and everyone's like, when's Carty coming to Ireland? When can we avail of it? And I just kind of wanted to make the point really that it's still very much in its infancy in the bigger world, let alone in the small country of Ireland. Sort of getting this kind of technology in at the moment is optimistic. So I've said there it's about €500,000 per patient for one treatment with the Carty therapy. So that's, unreal, isn't it? But that will come down in time because there are more companies working on the processes of making the cells and engineering the cells. And once that process becomes a little bit better, then the price of the treatment will come down. And then there needs to be more trials going forwards to prove that, the effects that the therapy has on patients actually it works and the side effects aren't as bad and the cost can be brought down. And then I think realistically going forwards it will be an option, but I think right now it's in its infancy. So this is just, I don't know how much people know about it, but this is just a basic diagram. So you see the human at the bottom there, where they will take these T cells from the patient. They then get sent off to a lab. The engineers in the lab sort of modify the cells to recognize the myeloma cells that they want to be killed. They grow all of those cells in a facility, and then the cells are then, in their big numbers, are put back into the patient. And then those sort of cells are know to go and kill the myeloma cells, if that makes sense. That's not a very good way of explaining it. But there's a lot of steps in that makes it a very expensive sort of procedure and having those units that can modify the cells and grow the cells is a very expensive and lengthy process. So another sort of cell therapy view, I suppose, is the natural killer cells, which is called sort of NK is the shortened phrase for it. It's very similar to the Carty therapy in the fact that we're using people's own cells and engineering them to kill the myeloma cells. These cells, it's very early days in fairness, but these cells they're very easy to reproduce and make in big numbers, so slightly easier to process than the Carty cells. And it says there that you can get sort of hundreds of doses from a single unit of blood and make these cells to be given to patients. But again, it's very early days. This is sort of science it's happening, but before it actually gets into a patient and we can prove that it works for a patient is a little bit down the pipeline. But I just wanted to give a nod to all the science that is going on, as much as we're not sort of really aware of it on a day-to-day basis. The last thing I wanted to talk about really is the fact that I don't think that we have enough trials in this country for patients like you or relatives or etc. It's not just the clinician's fault. Just putting that out there. There are an awful lot of ways and means and problems that mean that we can't generate enough interest for trials coming into this country, which is a real problem. There was a recent review by the Health Research Board that sort of nodded to several factors why we can't get the trials in numbers in this country, and they're kind of listed there really, the main ones. But unless you're in research, and this is my world, I could talk about this all day, but for you guys sitting there, for a lot of healthcare professionals, research isn't integral in their work, and it's not necessarily probably as up there as I'd like it to be on the list of priorities, but we've all got our own passions. And it kind of research needs to be integrated into the healthcare system to generate the interest of people, sort of blowing the trumpet of trials, if you like. A lot of our consultants don't get the time protected to do research. So any consultants that you do know that are working in trials or in research at all, they're doing it in their own time, because they're passionate about it. They don't get, say, a day a week allotted for this day we're going to go and do research. They do it on top of all of their duties that they're already doing. So that's a big problem, trying to get the consultants and clinicians involved, in a realistic way instead of them just giving loads of extra work. The public, general public, as much as a lot of healthcare professionals aren't aware, the general public, I don't think, really understand about trials and the implications of trials, and the fact that, trials are good. Trials aren't scary, but I think that's sort of us, Cancer Trials Ireland, we need to raise the awareness of this, the fact that we need to be bringing more clinical research to the country. So, and funding, but I could go on about funding all day long because there's never enough money for anything in this country anyway. So, briefly, benefits of clinical trials. I will talk about all of the benefits because I think trials are great, but this is what I do for a living. But you certainly get a lot more information, a lot more informed consent, I find, of the risks and side effects / benefits to taking the drugs that we're trying to give to you. Early access to new treatments that aren't necessarily available to the general sort of myeloma population, if you like. They're highly regulated. Nowhere else, sort of like in the healthcare system, is treatment as scrutinized as it is in a clinical trial. We're not just kind of like willy-nilly throwing drugs at you. We've had it regulated. Everybody said that it's okay. The safety has been ratified, etc. It's very well regulated. So we keep a close eye on all of our participants. Just saying there about the regulatory side of things, the ethics committees across the country review all of our protocols before they even get to any patients. The HPRA, which is they kind of monitor the safety of any drugs that we're giving to patients. A full review is given by those as well before we're allowed to bring a trial to the patients in this country. So there's an awful lot of background work that goes to it. We're not allowed to take data from patients in trials and just give it to anybody. Again, that's highly regulated as to how much data we can use from samples that are given by research participants, even down to sort of like, say, we're not allowed to give even the full name or even patient initials and a date of birth to anybody outside of the trial team, because we're not in the business of sort of selling data or letting people know your secrets or letting people know your date of birth and the fact that you have a disease. So it's very highly regulated, and no sort of patient-specific information is ever published in an inappropriate way. Myths about clinical trials are quickly whiz. A lot of people think that trials are only available when there are no other options for treatment. That's definitely not the case in my experience. In some cases it is, and certainly going back to the Carty therapies at the moment, the cases that have been sort of published and Carty works and everything, the patients that those treatments were offered to were kind of in a last resort situation. So there was no other sort of treatment option, so the Carties were given, and thankfully for some patients it did great. In the majority of cases in trials, certainly in this country, we're adding new drugs to a standard of care. So we never give just the study drug to one group of people and not the study drug to another group of people. Everybody gets the standard of care of treatment. One group gets the new trial drug. So it's more of a bonus being on a trial than not, because you're getting what works alongside something else which we think will really work. Guinea pig is a phrase that I get a lot. I don't want to be a guinea pig. I don't want to be your lab rat, blah, blah, blah. And I think I've hopefully kind of said that, in the previous slides, it's not the case at all. We do all the guinea pig stuff. We do all the lab-based stuff. But by the time it gets to a human being with a disease, we know that we're pretty sure that this stuff is going to work. All right. There's no point in us giving it to you if we don't think this stuff is going to work. So you're not a scientific experiment if you're on a clinical trial. Excuse me. Doctors and nurses can't tell you whether to go onto a clinical trial or not. We are there to give you as much information so you can make an informed decision of whether you want to or not. And only you can decide whether to take part. If you say no, it's absolutely fine, because your treatment's going to be not affected by the fact that you said no, you don't want to be on a trial. You're still going to get the drugs that we know work, just without the additional. And most trials will give you some benefit of, we may not know what that benefit is, but you at least get the benefit of a dedicated healthcare team who may give you slightly few more tests than you want, but you've always got the team there for you. And I said, we know the treatment that we're giving you, the standard of care treatment works, and we're hoping that the drug is going to help with that as well. Almost there. Most of you hopefully will have heard of this, what's the word, sort of program, I suppose, by Cancer Trials Ireland. If you're not sure of if there is a clinical trial available for you, just ask. This is a campaign that is run by the Cancer Trials Ireland. Obviously, their business is educating people about the trials that are available to patients. Most doctors in the country will know what trials are available, but if they don't, they know how to find out. So we're kind of almost putting the onus on patients as well to ask if there is a trial that could be suitable for them or their relatives. And that's me. Hopefully that's good enough.